The rain had been falling since before dawn, a relentless downpour that transformed Mud Creek's main thoroughfare into something more river than road. By mid-afternoon, when most sensible folk had retreated indoors to wait out the deluge, the street had become a treacherous landscape of churned earth and standing water. The wagon ruts had been carved so deep they could swallow a man's boot to the ankle, and water rushed through these channels with surprising force, carrying debris, horse-dung wood shavings from the sawmill, a child's broken toy, the sodden carcass of a drowned rat. The sound was constant and oppressive, a drumming that filled the ears and made conversation difficult even when standing close. Rain hammered against canvas awnings with a violence that suggested personal malice drove sideways under every overhang, found its way through gaps in walls and roofs that had seemed perfectly sound during dry weather. The air itself seemed to have turned to water, thick and cold and difficult to breathe, each inhalation bringing moisture into the lungs, along with the smell of wet earth and decay. Beneath a Conestoga freight wagon parked outside the livery stable, its massive bulk providing at least some shelter from the worst of the storm, two figures huddled in the mud. The wagon bed loomed above them like a roof, though water dripped steadily through gaps in the planking, each drop falling with methodical precision onto already soaked bodies that had long since given up trying to avoid the wetness. The older woman, Eleonora Weiss, had positioned herself on the outside of their small shelter, her body curled protectively around the younger woman in a posture that spoke of maternal instinct older than language. She was perhaps 60 years old, though hardship and hunger had aged her in ways that made precise calculation difficult. Her body was a collection of sharp angles and hollow bones, too prominent beneath skin that had lost the elasticity of youth and health. Her shawl, once a deep blue, now faded to a nondescript gray-brown, was soaked through the wool so heavy with water that it pulled at her shoulders with every slight movement. She could feel the wagon's iron-rimmed wheel pressing against her spine, a constant ache that had moved beyond pain into something darker and more intimate, a grinding presence that she had learned to ignore through sheer necessity. Her hands, gnarled with arthritis and rough from decades of labor, were wrapped around the younger woman with desperate care. The fingers no longer moved with the precision they once had, and the joints were swollen and stiff, each movement requiring conscious thought and effort. But they held on nonetheless, because holding on was all she had left to offer. The younger woman was Daisy Weiss, Eleonora's granddaughter, 18 years old, but so diminished by hunger that strangers routinely mistook her for a child. Her dress, pale blue cotton that had once been her best, saved for church and special occasions, clung to her frame with an intimacy that revealed every rib, every vertebra of her spine, the sharp juts of her hip bones. The fabric was torn in several places, the tears showing white against the faded dye, and mud had worked its way into the weave so thoroughly that no amount of washing would ever remove it completely. Daisy's face was turned toward the street, her eyes open but unfocused, watching the rain, without really seeing it. Her lips were cracked and pale, the corners showing the small splits that came from dehydration, despite being surrounded by water. Her hair, once thick and the color of wheat, hung in wet ropes around her face, darkened by the rain, to something between brown and black. The hunger in her belly was no longer the sharp pang she had felt on the first day without food, or even the second. That kind of hunger had teeth demanded attention, made the stomach cramp and complain. This was different, a hollow emptiness that had moved beyond mere physical discomfort into a kind of numbness, a void at her core that seemed to be slowly expanding, consuming her from the inside out. Her body had begun cannibalizing itself days ago, burning through whatever reserves of fat had once existed, now working on muscle tissue. She could feel it happening, a weakness that went beyond mere tiredness, a trembling in her limbs that made even simple movements difficult and uncertain. Her thoughts came slowly, as if wading through cold molasses. Sometimes she would find herself staring at something, a puddle, a horse, the hem of her own dress, with no memory of how long she had been looking or what she had been thinking about. Time had become elastic and unreliable, stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. "We haven't eaten in 5 days." Eleonora whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain's percussion. The words were in English, but heavily accented, each syllable shaped by a mouth that had learned a different language first and would never quite master this new one. 5 Tage, 5 days. She was not speaking to Daisy exactly. The words were more plea than communication, directed at the universe itself, or perhaps at God, if God was listening, if God cared about 2 immigrant women freezing and starving beneath a wagon in the American frontier. 5 days without food. But the truth was more complicated than that simple statement suggested. It had been 5 days since their last full meal, if half a loaf of stale bread and a handful of withered turnips could be called a meal. Before that, there had been other days of near-starvation days, when they ate nothing or next to nothing. Days that blurred together into a gray landscape of deprivation. The cold was its own kind of torment, working in conjunction with the hunger to sap what little strength remained. Daisy's feet had gone numb hours ago, a numbness that was simultaneously a blessing and a source of terror. She could not feel her toes anymore, could not wiggle them inside her worn boots. She knew in an abstract way that this was dangerous, that it meant something bad was happening to the flesh and bone down there in the darkness of her boots. But she could not muster the energy to care. A shadow fell across them, interrupting the gray monotony of the rain. Daisy's eyes, which had been half closed, snapped fully open with a surge of adrenaline that her exhausted body could barely produce. Every sudden change was a potential threat. She had learned that lesson thoroughly over the past 6 months. A man was kneeling in the mud directly in front of their shelter, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him if she had possessed the courage or the energy. He wore buckskin leggings and a shirt of the same material, both darkened by the rain to the color of wet bark. The fringe along the seams hung heavy and dripping, and the beadwork that decorated the chest and shoulders, intricate geometric patterns in red and white and blue, was barely visible beneath a layer of water that made the colors run and blur slightly. His hair was long and black, pulled back from his face and tied with a strip of red cloth that had once been bright but was now faded and stained. Eagle feathers hung from a leather band around his forehead, 3 of them, their white tips drooping with the weight of absorbed rain. His face was striking high cheekbones, strong jaw, a nose that had been broken at some point and healed slightly crooked. His skin was dark, weathered by sun and wind to the color of aged leather, marked with small scars that spoke of a life lived outdoors, a life of violence and hardship. But it was his eyes that arrested Daisy's attention and held it. They were dark brown, almost black, and they looked at her with an expression she had not seen in so long. She had almost forgotten such things existed: compassion. Not pity, which she had seen plenty of, and which always came with a certain contempt, a smugness from those who felt superior to the pitied. This was different. This was recognition of shared suffering, an acknowledgement of pain witnessed and understood. In his hands, large hands scarred across the knuckles, the nails broken and rimmed with dirt, he held a loaf of bread. It was round and brown, the crust split across the top in that characteristic way that only well-made bread splits the fissure, revealing the pale interior that was still steaming faintly in the cold air. The smell of it reached Daisy even through the rain, and the general stench of the muddy street yeast and wheat and salt, the smell of something that had been created with care, with intention, with the assumption that human beings deserved to eat things that were made properly. Daisy's mouth flooded with saliva so suddenly and copiously that she choked on it, her body reacting to the sight and smell with a violence that bypassed conscious thought entirely. Her stomach which had been a dull ache suddenly clenched with desperate need, cramping so hard she had to press one hand against it to keep from crying out. Tears sprang to her eyes, not from emotion, but from pure physical reaction, her body remembering what it was to want food, to need food. Eleonora's grip on her tightened slightly, and Daisy felt her grandmother's body go rigid with tension. She understood immediately why. Accepting anything from this man, a Lakota, that much was obvious from his dress and bearing, would mark them, would associate them with Indians. In the minds of everyone watching, and there were always people watching in Mud Creek, always eyes behind windows and curtains, always gossip spreading like wildfire through the small community. On the boardwalk across the street beneath the overhang of the general store, a cluster of men had stopped their conversation to watch. Daisy could see them in her peripheral vision, could feel the weight of their attention like a physical pressure. One of them, a big man with a red face and a beard streaked with gray, said something she could not quite hear, but the tone carried clearly enough. Contempt. Anger. Another man spat tobacco juice into the street, with deliberate force, the brown stream arcing through the rain before disappearing into the mud. The gesture was a comment in itself, a statement of disgust that required no words. That Indian ought to move along. Someone said loud enough to carry across the street the voicemail, and aggressive and certain of its righteousness. Leave decent folk alone. We got problems enough without his kind stirring things up. The kneeling man did not react to the words at all. His face remained calm, his expression unchanging, as if he had not heard, or as if such words were so common they were not worth acknowledging. He simply held the bread out toward Eleonora and Daisy, his movements slow and careful, his posture respectful in a way that seemed almost ceremonial. "Take it," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. He spoke English with only a slight accent, and the words clear and precise. No one should starve in this rain. The statement was simple, almost plain, but something in the way he said it gave the words weight. This was not charity offered from a position of superiority. This was not pity or condescension. This was one human being recognizing the suffering of others and responding with the resources available to him. Hoofbeats splashed through the mud nearby, the sound cutting through the rain's steady drumming. Two riders pulled their horses to a stop at the edge of the boardwalk, water streaming from the brims of their hats, their long coats hanging open despite the weather, to display revolvers holstered at their hips. The display was deliberate, a statement about power and readiness, about who belonged in this town and who did not. The riders sat in their saddles without dismounting, elevated above the scene, looking down at the kneeling man and the two women, with expressions of cold assessment. They did not speak immediately, but their presence was a form of speech, a question asked, without words. What is happening here? Whose side are we on? What rules are being broken or upheld? The simple act of offering bread had become complicated, had become political, had become dangerous. Eleonora's hand emerged from beneath her shawl, trembling so badly that it looked palsied. The joints of her fingers were swollen with arthritis, the knuckles enlarged to nearly twice their normal size, and the skin was mottled with age spots and old scars. She reached for the bread, with the hesitation of someone expecting the offering to be snatched away at the last moment, expecting mockery or cruelty, expecting the world to behave as it usually did. Her fingers closed around the loaf, and the warmth of it seemed to shock her. She gasped a small sound, barely audible, and her eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with the rain. She pulled the bread close to her chest, cradling it, as if it were something infinitely precious and fragile. And then, with shaking hands, she broke it in half. The crust cracked with a sound that seemed impossibly loud, and steam rose from the interior in a pale cloud. She handed one half to Daisy, pressing it into her granddaughter's hands with a force that suggested urgency. "Iss," she whispered in German. "Eat, schnell." Daisy did not need to be told twice. She bit into the bread with a desperation that bordered on violence. Her teeth tearing at the crust, her jaws working mechanically to chew what suddenly seemed like far too large a piece. The taste of it exploded across her tongue, salt and wheat and yeast flavors so rich and complex after days of nothing that they were almost overwhelming, almost painful. She chewed slowly, despite every instinct screaming at her to swallow immediately, to cram more into her mouth to eat until the bread was gone and the terrible gnawing void in her belly was filled. "Thank you," Eleonora said to the kneeling man, her voice breaking on the words. "Thank you. Danke. Thank you." She repeated it in both languages, as if one expression of gratitude was insufficient. The man nodded once, a small motion of his head that acknowledged her thanks without making it into something that required further response. He rose to his feet in a single fluid movement, his buckskin leggings now caked with mud up to the knees. Dr. Horatio Pike had been standing in the doorway of his apothecary for the past several minutes, watching the scene unfold with growing emotion. He was a man of moderate height and slight build, his body carrying the softness of someone who worked with his mind rather than his hands. His hair was graying at the temples and receding slightly at the forehead, and he wore wire-rimmed spectacles that were perpetually sliding down his nose. He pushed the spectacles up now with one finger and stepped out onto the boardwalk. The rain immediately began soaking through his wool coat, but he ignored it, his attention focused entirely on the tableau before him, and the Lakota man standing in the mud, with quiet dignity, the two women clutching bread, as if it were gold, the riders sitting in silent judgment. The anger that had been building in Horatio's chest for months, carefully controlled, carefully hidden, carefully channeled into his work, suddenly crystallized into something sharp and clear. He had watched this town become meaner over the past year, watched it become a place where kindness was suspect and cruelty was routine. He had told himself that he was a doctor, that his job was to heal bodies, not societies, that he could not afford to take sides in political disputes. He had been lying to himself. He walked toward the wagon, his boots splashing through puddles, and one of the riders, a young man with a scar across his left cheek that Horatio himself had stitched 6 months earlier, called out with deliberate insolence. "Hey, Doc, you fixing to vouch for these beggars?" The word beggars was delivered with a sneer, with contempt dripping from every syllable. Horatio stopped walking and looked at the rider with an expression that was carefully controlled. He let the silence stretch for several seconds, let it become uncomfortable. "Anyone who interferes with a man feeding the hungry," Horatio said finally, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly across the muddy street, ought to be ashamed of himself. The words hung in the air like an indictment. The rider's face flushed red blood, rising to his cheeks in a way that made the scar stand out white and prominent. Horatio turned his attention to the Lakota man, making deliberate eye contact. "Come to my surgery when you can," he said. "We should talk." The man nodded, understanding, passing between them without need for elaborate explanation. He turned and walked away, leading a horse that Horatio had not noticed before, a scrappy paint with intelligent eyes. The people on the boardwalk parted to let him pass. The two riders remained where they were for another long moment, then turned their horses and rode off toward the eastern edge of town, toward Kincaid's ranch, their forms gradually dissolving into the gray curtain of rain. Horatio crouched down beside the wagon, his knees protesting the movement. He looked at Eleonora with the practiced eye of a physician, noting the gray cast to her skin and the sunken quality of her eyes, the way her chest moved with each breath, shallow and rapid, and accompanied by a faint wheeze. "Can you walk?" he asked gently. Eleonora nodded, though the movement seemed to cost her considerable effort. "Yeah. Yes. I can walk." Horatio helped her out from under the wagon, with careful hands supporting her weight as she struggled to stand, and he was shocked by how light she was. She weighed perhaps 90 pounds, much of that was bone and wet fabric. He could feel her ribs through the shawl, could count them if he wanted to. Daisy scrambled out after her grandmother, still clutching her half of the bread against her chest with both hands, protecting it from rain and thieves and any other force that might try to take it from her. She moved with the caution of someone whose body had become unreliable, testing each step before committing her full weight. The rain had softened somewhat, no longer the violent downpour of earlier, but settling into a steady drizzle that was somehow more insidious, more exhausting. "Come on," Horatio said, his voice kind but firm. "You'll catch your death out here." He led them across the street to his apothecary. The bell above the door rang cheerfully as they entered, a bright tinkling sound that seemed to belong to a different world. The interior was warm and dry and smelled of herbs and medicines and wood smoke from the stove in the back room. Horatio guided them through the front area, past shelves lined with bottles and jars, past the counter where he mixed prescriptions, and into the back room that served as his surgery and living quarters. A pot-bellied stove dominated one corner of the room, its iron surface radiating heat. He settled Eleonora and Daisy on a wooden bench near the stove, positioning them close enough to benefit from the warmth, but not so close that they would burn themselves. Then he stoked the fire, adding split wood from a neat stack beside the stove, adjusting the damper to increase the draw. The wood caught quickly, and the temperature in the room began to rise perceptibly. Horatio took a thick wool blanket from a shelf and draped it over Eleonora's shoulders, tucking it around her with practiced movements. Then he poured 2 tin cups of tea from a pot he kept warming on the stove. And he added honey liberally, to both real honey from a jar he kept for medicinal purposes. He set the cups on the bench beside the women and watched as they wrapped their hands around the warm metal, drawing heat into their cold flesh. They sipped slowly, carefully, and he could see the relief spreading across their faces. "Stay here as long as you need," Horatio said. "You're safe here. No one will bother you while you're under my roof." Daisy looked up at him with eyes that were still slightly unfocused. "Why are you helping us?" Her voice was hoarse and thin, barely above a whisper. Horatio adjusted his spectacles and gave her a small, sad smile. "Because someone has to. Because if decent people don't help when help is needed, then what kind of world are we building here?" He turned away to give them privacy, and behind him he heard Daisy begin to cry, quiet, choked sobs that she tried to muffle behind her hand. He let her cry, understanding that sometimes tears were necessary. The rain stopped entirely by late afternoon, leaving the streets slick and steaming under a low gray sky. Daisy sat near the stove, her dress beginning to dry in stiff, uneven patches. Eleonora had fallen asleep on the bench, her breathing accompanied by a wet wheeze that frightened Daisy more with each passing day. Horatio had checked her lungs with his stethoscope, and when he straightened up, his face had been grim. As the light began to fade, Daisy felt the familiar gnawing in her stomach. The bread was gone, consumed hours ago, and while it had taken the edge off her starvation, it had awakened her body's demands. She slipped out the back door of the apothecary as quietly as she could. The alley behind the bakery was narrow and cluttered with barrels and crates. She moved quietly, her feet making almost no sound on the wet ground. She reached the ash barrel near the back door and peered inside. A burnt crust lay atop a pile of ash and charcoal, still faintly warm. Her hand reached for it. A boot slammed the barrel lid down with a crash, narrowly missing her knuckles. Daisy jerked back, heart hammering, and looked up. Silas Crane loomed over her, his slicker hanging open to reveal the revolver holstered at his hip. He was a tall man, lean and hard, with a narrow face and eyes that reminded Daisy of a hawk watching a rabbit-cold, calculating patient. "Stealing from Kincaid's town again?" Crane snarled. His voice was low and sharp, meant to cut. He grabbed Daisy's arm and yanked her away from the barrel, dragging her into the center of the alley. Daisy was 18 years old, but hunger had hollowed her out until she felt like a rag doll in his grip. She twisted, trying to pull free, and the seam of her sleeve tore with a soft, ripping sound. The movement exposed her forearm, pale thin, and the bones sharp beneath the skin. Crane's eyes traveled over her arm with something like disgust. "You think you can just take what you want?" His voice was rising now, intended for an audience. "Your old man tried that. Didn't work out so well for him, did it?" The words hit Daisy like physical blows. She stopped struggling and stared at him. "That's right." Crane continued, leaning closer, his breath hot on her face and smelling of whiskey and tobacco. Stefan Weiss was a fool. He should have kept his mouth shut, should have taken what Kincaid offered and moved on. But he had to play hero, had to wave his papers around and talk about rights and justice. He spat the last words as if they tasted foul. "There's no justice out here, girl. Here, there's only power. And your father had none. Just like you." He lifted his quirt, a short leather whip designed for use on horses, and held it high. He did not strike immediately. The threat was its own form of violence. He wanted everyone watching to see this moment, to witness what happened to people who defied Kincaid's men. The lash never fell. A hand snapped around Crane's wrist with the speed of a striking snake. Crane's head jerked around in genuine surprise. He found himself staring into the face of the Lakota warrior, so close he could see the individual pores in the other man's skin. For a moment, genuine fear flickered across Crane's features. He had not heard the warrior approach, had not seen him enter the alley. "That is enough," Maddow said quietly, his voice barely above a conversational tone, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Crane's jaw tightened. He tried to yank his arm free, twisting his wrist and pulling back, but Maddow's grip held as if Crane's arm were caught in an iron vise. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, and the air in the alley seemed to thicken with potential violence. A crowd was beginning to gather at the mouth of the alley. A new voice cut through the tension. "What in blazes is going on here?" Marshal Victor pushed through the crowd with the authority of office. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with a drooping mustache and small eyes. A silver star was pinned to his vest. His palm rested on the butt of his pistol. His eyes flicked from Crane to Maddow to Daisy. This girl was stealing. Crane set his voice tight with anger. He gestured toward the ash barrel. "I was teaching her a lesson." "Looks to me like you were about to beat a woman half your size," Maddow said evenly. He released Crane's wrist and stepped back, putting himself between Crane and Daisy. Victor chewed the edge of his mustache, weighing options. He owed Kincaid more than one debt, money loaned, favors granted, silence bought. But he also knew that a public beating of a starving girl could turn town sentiment against him. And the Lakota warrior was another problem entirely. Yellow Elk's band was small, but they still had riders and rifles. If this escalated, Fort Shiloh would come asking questions. "Crane," Victor said finally, "step back. Report to Kincaid. Let him decide what to do." Crane's face darkened, but he obeyed. He glared at Maddow with pure venom and then at Daisy. "This isn't over," he muttered. He turned and strode out of the alley, his boots splashing through puddles. Victor turned to Maddow. "You need to move along, friend. This is town business." Maddow did not move. He looked at Daisy, seeing desperate hope in her eyes, and made a decision. "The woman and the young one are under my protection." He said clearly so everyone could hear. "They work for my camp. You touch them again, you answer to Yellow Elk." The claim was a lie. Daisy had never set foot in the Lakota camp, but it created a shield. Victor's mouth thinned into a hard line. He stared at Maddo for a long moment. Finally, he shook his head. "Not worth spilling blood over a scrap of bread," he said at last. He turned to the crowd. "Everyone clear out. Show's over." The onlookers dispersed slowly. Daisy pulled herself to her feet, her legs shaking. Maddo stepped beside her, and together they walked back to Horatio's apothecary in silence. Inside the surgery, Eleonora was awake, her eyes red-rimmed and her breathing labored. She saw Daisy enter with Maddo and struggled to sit up straighter. "What happened?" Eleonora asked, her voice hoarse. "Trouble," Daisy said simply. She told her grandmother about Crane the Alley and Maddo's claim. Eleonora listened, her face growing paler, and when Daisy finished, the old woman closed her eyes and sighed deeply. "We bring danger to him now," Eleonora said, looking at Maddo. "To his people." Maddo shook his head. The danger was already there. Kincaid's dam is killing the creek. My people are hungry too. We cannot stand by and watch injustice happen in front of us and do nothing. Horatio stepped forward, arms crossed. "If Kincaid decides to make an example of you two, he will use it as an excuse to go after the Lakota. I have heard him talk in the saloon. He wants that land where Yellow Elk is camped, wants it for his cattle and eventually to sell to the railroad. He has been looking for an excuse to call in the army. We need to act before he manufactures one." Eleonora reached into the folds of her shawl with trembling fingers and pulled out a flat bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The oilcloth was stained and worn, its edges frayed. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a small sheaf of papers yellowed and creased. "My son hid these," she said, her accent thickening with emotion, "at the homestead, in a trunk under the bed. They are important proof of our claim to the land, to the water. Without them, we are nothing but beggars with no rights." Horatio picked up one of the papers with careful fingers and held it to the lamplight. It was a hand-drawn map labeled in Stefan's careful script, showing the course of Mud Creek before Kincaid's dam, a detailed rendering that included depth measurements, flow rates, seasonal variations. Notes in the margins recorded observations. Another paper was the homestead deed, properly filed and stamped by the territorial office in black ink. The stamp showed an eagle with spread wings, and beneath it was a handwritten provision. "Water rights appurtenant to this claim, in accordance with territorial law," dated March 15, 1852. The date was significant. It predated Kincaid's ranch claims by nearly 2 years. "This could matter," Horatio said slowly. "If we can get the rest of the documents, we might be able to challenge Kincaid's claim in a territorial court. Water rights are taken seriously. Even out here, there are laws about prior appropriation." Maddo frowned. "You said the trunk is still at the homestead." Eleonora nodded, her breath wheezing. "Under the bed. Locked. My son kept everything there." "Then we have to go back," Daisy said. Her voice was steady, though her hands were not. Maddo looked at her and saw something he recognized, the stubborn refusal to give up, the determination to keep fighting, even when fighting seemed pointless. "All right," he said. "We go tonight, before Crane tells Kincaid what happened." At dusk, Maddo borrowed a pony from his cousin who was waiting outside town. The pony was a scrappy paint with intelligent eyes. Maddo helped Eleonora onto the animal's back, and Daisy walked alongside, pushing a stubborn handcart that Horatio had lent them. The road to Willow Fork was rough and rutted, winding through low hills covered in sage. Halfway to the homestead, the road dropped into a shallow wash. As they climbed the far side, Maddo heard hoofbeats drumming behind them, growing louder. He turned and saw 3 riders silhouetted against the darkening sky. Crane and 2 of his men, rifles across their saddles, coming fast. "Get down!" Maddo shouted. A bullet whined past his ear and struck sparks from a rock near the cart. Daisy dropped flat and Maddo hauled Eleonora from the pony, dragging her into the narrow wash. More shots rang out, kicking up sprays of wet earth. Maddo pulled his carbine and fired back, but he only had 3 rounds. He could not win a straight fight. He read the land quickly. Dry grass clung to the slope above the riders, and the wind was blowing toward them. He crawled along the edge of the wash, reached a thick clump of dead vegetation, and struck flint against steel. The sparks were bright in the gathering darkness. On the 4th strike, a spark caught in a twist of grass. He blew on it gently, coaxing it to life, and watched as a small orange glow spread. He shoved the smoldering ember into the base of the clump, and the flames leaped up with shocking speed. Fire raced up the hillside, driven by the wind. The riders' horses spooked immediately, their eyes rolling white, their nostrils flaring. Crane cursed and fought to control his mount. The other 2 riders fell back, trying to calm their panicked animals. Maddo whistled low to Daisy, and together they shoved the cart into a side gully hidden by willows. They moved as quietly as they could and left the pony's tracks leading straight ahead as a false trail. Then they slipped into the brush. By the time they reached the Weiss homestead, full dark had fallen. The cabin stood silhouetted against the stars, its shape jagged and wrong. The door hung half off its hinges. Through the glassless windows, Daisy could see that the interior had been ransacked. Furniture lay, overturned chairs smashed the table on its side. Flour had been scattered across the floor. Daisy stepped through the doorway, her feet crunching on broken pottery, and felt her throat tighten. This had been her home. She could still see her father sitting at the table, bent over his maps by candlelight. She could still hear his voice telling her that things would get better. He had been wrong. Maddo's hand touched her shoulder for just a moment, a brief touch meant to ground her. "The trunk," he said quietly. Daisy nodded and crossed to the bed. Under the bed frame in the shadows, the trunk remained. Its lock had been hacked at with a hatchet, the hasp bent, but it still held. Daisy pried the trunk open with a poker from the cold fireplace. The lid creaked as it swung back. Inside, beneath, folded shirts and a worn quilt that still smelled faintly of her father's pipe tobacco, she found what they had come for. A thick ledger, its leather cover worn smooth, more papers rolled and tied with string, and a small tin box that rattled. She opened the ledger and saw pages filled with her father's neat handwriting dates, amounts, names, all recorded in careful columns. Her father had been methodical. "We have it," she whispered. Outside, lantern light flickered between the ruined barn and the cabin, moving closer. Crane's men had found them. Maddo pulled Eleonora to her feet. "Is there another way out?" Daisy nodded quickly. She led them to a corner of the cabin where the floorboards were loose. She pried the boards up and revealed a shallow root cellar that smelled of damp earth. At the back of the cellar, a narrow drainage ditch opened into darkness. "It goes under the corral. Comes out near the creek." Bullets splintered the door with a sound like breaking bones. Maddo pushed Eleonora through the ditch first, then Daisy, who had to push the trunk ahead of her. Maddo followed last, pulling the boards back over the opening, just as Crane kicked the door open with a crash. They crawled through the tunnel on their bellies. The smell of damp earth was overwhelming. It was completely dark, absolute blackness. Daisy moved by feel alone, her hands reaching out ahead of her, touching cold stone and wet earth and the smooth surface of the trunk. She could hear Eleonora's coughing ahead of her, and behind her she could hear Maddo's steady breathing. Above, muffled by earth, she heard boots stomping across the floor, voices shouting. When they emerged near the creek, the night was silent, except for the sound of running water, thin and weak, but still flowing. Maddo pulled them to their feet, all 3 of them gasping, covered in mud. He oriented himself quickly, finding the stars, and led them south at a fast walk. By dawn they had reached Yellow Elk's camp. Yellow Elk's camp was tucked into a bend of Mud Creek, where cottonwoods once shaded a broad, healthy stream. Now the water was thin and sluggish, barely ankle-deep in places, and the banks were cracked. Canvas teepees and brush shelters dotted the clearing. The Lakota eyed Eleonora and Daisy with open suspicion when Maddo brought them into camp. An old immigrant woman and a young white woman were trouble. Several women pulled their children closer, and a few of the young men muttered among themselves. Yellow Elk stepped out of the largest teepee wrapped in a blanket. He was old, his face deeply lined, his hair more gray than black, but his eyes were sharp. "You bring us more trouble?" he asked in Lakota, his tone dry but not hostile. "I bring us a chance to fight back," Maddo replied in the same language. He explained quickly the dam, the stolen water, the documents proving Kincaid's claim illegal. Yellow Elk listened, his expression unreadable. When Maddo finished, the old man was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "They can stay. But if soldiers come, they leave first. I will not risk our children for strangers." Daisy and Eleonora were given a small space near the edge of camp. A woman named Wickapi brought them a bowl of thin stew and a hide to sit on. Over the following days, tensions in the camp grew. Young warriors wanted action. One of them, a warrior named Seaton, argued loudly that they should cut the dam loose in the night. "We have the right," Seaton would say, his voice rising. "The water is ours. It has always been ours. Why should we wait for the white man's courts?" An older man named Tassa would shake his head. "Because courts are slow, but soldiers are fast. If we destroy the dam, the army will come. They will burn our lodges and scatter our families. I have seen it happen before." The debates went on for hours, the same arguments made in slightly different words each night. Yellow Elk sat in the center of these debates, listening, saying little. Maddo spent his days checking snares and setting new ones, trying to bring in enough game to stretch the band's supplies. The work was frustrating. The animals were scarce. Over the course of a week, he managed to catch a few rabbits, one muskrat, and a sage hen. He brought the meat back to camp and shared it, keeping none for himself. Daisy followed him one afternoon. She found him in a narrow ravine where a trickle of water still seeped from the rocks. He was setting a snare, twisting the cord. "Can you show me?" she asked. Maddo glanced at her, surprised. He nodded and handed her the cord. The loop must be large enough for the head to pass through, but small enough to tighten before the animal can pull free. Daisy tried to copy the motion, but her fingers were cold and clumsy. Without speaking, Maddo covered her hands with his own, guiding them. For a moment, they were both very still, aware of breath and warmth. Then he stepped back, and the lesson continued, as if nothing had changed. But the thread between them was there now, fine and unspoken, and both of them felt it. In town, another thread was being woven. A man named Armand Valentin arrived on the afternoon stage dressed in a clean waistcoat. He introduced himself to Victor as a rail and orphan agent authorized to arrange placements for children on an eastbound orphan train. Quietly, he offered Kincaid another service troublesome families could vanish if their heirs were placed back east. What no one knew was that Valentine was Kincaid's cousin. He had grown up poor while Kincaid grew rich, and resentment had festered. When Stefan Weiss had threatened Kincaid's operation, Valentine had seen opportunity. He had already listed Daisy Weiss, age unknown, among children he intended to take east. Meanwhile, Horatio was called to the Lakota camp to treat a boy who had cut his leg badly. The wound was infected, the edges hot and swollen. Horatio cleaned it with carbolic acid, packed it with yarrow poultice, and stitched it shut with horsehair thread. While he worked, he examined Eleonora. Her lungs rattled with every breath. He gave her willow bark tea, but knew there was little else he could do. One evening in Horatio's surgery, Eleonora spread Stefan's papers on the table. Horatio studied them carefully. Stefan's map showed the creek before Kincaid's dam. The deed gave Stefan priority water rights. The ledger recorded systematic bribery. In the small tin box, Horatio found dull metallic grains. He touched one to his tongue and then spat it out. Mercury. They use it at the Iron Mountain diggings. If it washes into the creek, everyone downstream will sicken. Mato stepped forward. Our children drink that water. So do the homesteaders, Horatio said. But the courts won't act on the mercury, not yet. But the water rights theft and fraud that they'll understand. If we can get these documents to the territorial surveyor next month, we can force an inquiry. Eleonora gripped Daisy's hand. Your father knew. That is why they killed him. We will finish what he started, Daisy said. What none of them knew was that Valentine had finalized paperwork for Daisy's removal. In 2 days, he would take her to Ghost Creek for the orphan train. Silas Kincaid rode to Fort Shiloh and requested a meeting with Lieutenant Arthur Hayes, a young officer eager to prove himself. Kincaid told Hayes that Yellow Elk's band was preparing to raid Mud Creek. He showed Hayes a forged letter from a frightened homesteader. Hayes agreed to preemptive action. He mustered 30 troopers and rode south at dawn. The raid came without warning. Bluecoats and Kincaid's riders crashed into the Lakota camp as the sun broke the horizon, firing carbines and slashing tent ropes. Women and children scrambled for the willows, screaming. Teepees burned. Yellow Elk rode out with a white cloth tied to his lance, shouting for parley. We are peaceful. We have done nothing. A young trooper, spooked, raised his carbine and fired. The bullet struck Yellow Elk in the chest. The old man fell from his horse and did not move. Mato fought to cover the retreat, firing until his barrel was too hot to touch. A bullet punched through his right shoulder, spinning him around. The impact numbed his arm instantly, and the carbine fell from his grip. Eleonora, too weak to run, collapsed behind a fallen log, coughing blood. Daisy tried to lift her, but could not. Horatio made a desperate choice. He loaded Eleonora and the worst wounded into his wagon, threw a tarp over them, and drove toward his homestead. In the chaos, Crane's men seized the wagon holding Stefan's trunk. Crane grinned, hauling it onto his horse. By mid-morning, the camp was a ruin. The surviving Lakota had scattered. The soldiers pulled back. Kincaid's men returned to Mud Creek. Mato, pale with blood loss, stumbled into Mud Creek that afternoon. He found Horatio near the livery. They took Daisy, Horatio said. Armand Valentin? He had papers signed by Victor. They took her an hour ago. They're headed to Ghost Creek through the canyon. If she reaches the train, she'll vanish east. Mato looked at his useless arm and then at the road. How far? 30 miles. Through the canyon where Kincaid's dam is. Then we ride. Mato gathered what strength he had. Taka and Sitan agreed to come, both wounded. Horatio insisted on joining. They brought Deputy Amos. They rode hard, following wagon tracks. By full dark, they reached the canyon where Kincaid's dam squatted between cliffs. Near the dam's base, a supply cabin stood. Lamplight flickered in the window. Valentine's wagon was parked nearby. Using the approaching storm as cover, they crept along the canyon rim and descended slowly. Mato moved first. He dropped onto a guard, wrapping his left arm around the man's throat. Taxa and Seaton followed, disarming the other guards. But the noise drew attention. More riders appeared. Shots rang out. Inside, Horatio shouted. They dove for the cabin. Inside, Daisy and 3 other children were huddled in the corner, wrists bound. When Daisy saw Mato, her eyes went wide. You came, she whispered. Always, Maddow said, cutting the cords. Outside, Kincaid appeared on the dam top. You want a siege? You've picked the wrong valley. Bullets thudded into the cabin walls. Horatio shielded the children. Kincaid ordered his men to bring up black powder kegs. Set charges at the dam base, blow the whole cabin into the creek. Maddow saw men hauling heavy wooden barrels toward the timber struts. Black powder was dangerous volatile. Daisy saw a narrow spillway tunnel running under the dam. With Maddow's arm useless, no one could crawl through. No one except Daisy. Maddow shook his head. That tunnel floods, you don't come back. Daisy's jaw tightened. You brought me bread when no one else would. Let me bring you time. She touched his hand, then took a coil of slow match fuse and slipped out the back. Daisy dropped into the spillway. The water was shockingly cold. Darkness swallowed her. She felt along rough stone, searching for fuses. The tunnel was narrow walls scraping her shoulders. Above, one of Kincaid's men fumbled with a lantern near an open keg of powder. The lantern slipped, struck the ground, and flame licked toward loose powder. Fire, get back! The powder ignited with a massive roar that shook the canyon. The blast tore away part of the dam's base, killing 3 men. The dam began to fail. Under the spillway, Daisy felt the tunnels shudder. She realized the dam was breaking. She lunged forward toward a faint lessening of darkness. The dam gave. A wall of brown water slammed through the gap. The pressure tore Daisy from her feet. She was underwater, tumbling. Then her hand caught a rock. She pulled herself up, gasping. The water level was rising. She pulled herself along the wall. The tunnel widened, and she was ejected into the churning flood. Maddow saw the dam break. Get higher, climb. Horatio threw the girl onto a higher ledge. Taka and Setan pulled the boys to safety. Amos shoved Valentin toward higher ground. Kincaid, clutching a metal strongbox, tried to run. The collapsing structure bucked beneath him. He lost his footing. The strongbox's weight pulled him sideways. Then the flood took him, smashing him against canyon walls. The flash flood hurtled down the canyon. By the time it reached Mud Creek, it had spread wider. Streets flooded, but the town survived. When the surge passed, Maddow scrambled down, calling Daisy's name. Here. I am here. He found her clinging to a boulder downstream, pale and shaking but alive. You came back, he said. Together they climbed out as rain began to fall. When the water subsided, the dam was a mangled ruin. Horatio found Kincaid's strongbox lodged between rocks. Inside were ledgers matching Stefan's records of the entire scheme on paper. The surviving ranch hands had no fight left. Amos gathered them as witnesses. Valentin tried claiming he was only following orders, but Amos kept his gun level. Victor tried to slip away. Lakota riders and homesteaders intercepted him. He surrendered. Weeks later, a territorial surveyor stood on the bank of a restored Mud Creek Stefan's map and Kincaid's papers in hand. He issued his ruling the dam had been illegal. The Weiss homestead was restored to Daisy. A portion of Kincaid's land was acknowledged as tribal range. Valentin was sentenced to 20 years hard labor. Victor received 15 years. Crane turned state's witness, confirming Stefan's death was murder. He received 10 years. Eleonora did not live to see spring. In the small sod house on the reclaimed claim, she pressed Stefan's pocket watch into Daisy's hand. You keep the land, she whispered. You keep the water. I promise, grandmother. Your father would be proud. Eleonora smiled peacefully, closed her eyes, and her breathing stopped. They buried Eleonora on a knoll overlooking the creek. Maddow stacked stones over the grave, a task reserved for family. Everyone understood the significance. Daisy watched him work. When he finished, she placed her hand on the topmost stone. Then she took Matto's hand, and they walked back down the hill together. 1 year later, on a warm spring morning, Matto walked up the path to the house, now a proper cabin of milled lumber with glass windows. He carried a fresh loaf of bread from the bakery. Daisy stepped out onto the porch sleeves, rolled from working in the garden. The garden was thriving. She was still slight, but her gaze was steady. She had survived and built something from the ashes. The homestead had been transformed. The irrigation ditch had been repaired, a communal project. The field was green with crops. A new barn stood and horses grazed in the corral. The valley was changing. More homesteaders had arrived. They worked together, treated the Lakota as neighbors. The Lakota camp had moved to the officially recognized tribal land. Children played along the creek. Gardens grew. Life continued. Matto stopped in the yard. In his hands was the bread still warm. He held it out not as rescuer, but as partner. No one goes hungry on this land again. Daisy stepped down. When she took the bread, her fingers folded over his for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Behind them, children's voices rang out, Lakota and homesteader children playing together. The old divisions were being bridged. 2 weeks earlier, Matto had given Daisy a carved horse, a formal Lakota proposal. She had accepted it. Last week they had been married in a ceremony, honoring both traditions, a Lakota blessing by Taka, and Christian vows spoken before Horatio. Now they stood in the yard, and Daisy looked toward the creek, running clear and strong. She thought about her father, about his belief that justice would prevail if people knew the truth. He had been right, though he had not lived to see it. "It will not be easy," Daisy said quietly. "The land is harsh." "Yes," Matto agreed. "But we have survived worse, and we will not face it alone." He was right. They had allies, homesteaders who had learned cooperation, Lakota, who had found a way to remain, a doctor who had rediscovered purpose, a deputy who had learned courage. They had the law on their side, and they had each other. Daisy looked at Matto at the resolve in his eyes. She knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Day by hard day, season by season. Behind them, Mud Creek ran full and clear, its voice speaking of continuity and renewal. The water that Kincaid had tried to control now flowed free again. And in the valley that had seen so much violence, people were building something new, something that honored the past without being trapped by it, something that looked toward the future with hope. Daisy squeezed Matto's hand once, then released it. They had work to do. The garden needed tending, the horses needed feeding, and there was a meeting that evening to discuss the harvest. Life continued, ordinary and extraordinary. As they walked toward the house together, Daisy thought about the bread Matto had offered her that first day, about how a simple act of kindness had transformed an entire valley. She thought about her father's words, "Hard work and justice will prevail." He had been right. It had just taken longer and cost more than any of them had imagined. But they had prevailed. And that, in the end, was enough.
Sacred tune under the watchful eye of the moon. Shadows stretch across the land. Time slips softly through the sand. Oh, spirits high, oh, spirits near, guide my steps. make my path clear. The earth it sings, the sky replies, whispers of the plains will never die. The eagle soars, its wings so wide, a bridge between the earth and sky. Rivers weave like stories told, ancient voices strong and bold. Through the fire, through the smoke, every ember holds a hope. O spirits high, O spirits near, guide my steps, make my path clear. The earth it sings, the sky replies, whisper